Hi guys, Pastor Mark here. Hope you're well as we continue our study of Ephesians this week. Part 62, Know Your True Enemy is the subheading, Know Your True Enemy. And it's vital that we truly know who our true enemy is. We're going to be in this section about the whole armour of God, maybe for a week or two, as we conclude our whole study of Ephesians. There is so much in these verses. Let me read verse 12 and 13. In fact, let me read 10 and 11 first. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles or the schemes of the devil. And then I want to read these two verses, 12 and 13 tonight. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armour of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, stand. Okay, John MacArthur says this in his commentary: the greatest enemy is not the world we see, corrupt and wicked as it is, but the world we cannot see, end quote. So often we reduce the enemy to flesh and to a person, when in fact there are so many things going on that we cannot see. As we are going to be in these verses, as I said, for a few weeks, I want to labour on this thought. Yesterday, I never had enough time, but yesterday I said at the end of my teaching that them that fail to follow God and his word often become the tool that the enemy uses. Some of the greatest enemies I've faced, probably the greatest battles I've faced, are not with non-believing, heathen, never going to church people, but usually people that's been in church. I'm not sure whether they're believers or saved or not, but people who have heard the word, people who have sat under the word, and I've found it's them that ignore the instruction of these amazing 6 chapters of Ephesians, as the ones that Satan uses mostly to carry and dish out persecution and attacks on us and all sorts of stuff. The so-called believer who don't listen or apply truth, the so-called believer who continues to sin, the so-called believer who does not walk in the fullness, the believer who does not renew the mind. They are the ones, I believe, that Satan mostly raises up to persecute the faithful. Not heathens, but disobedient, shallow and often fake convert believers. People who are round about church, maybe are in church, maybe still sitting in the pews. Disgruntled believers, people who once sat in the pews. And Paul talks about Alexander the coppersmith. Alexander the coppersmith was not somebody out in the fringes of society. He was always someone who was in the church and attacking from within. And it happens that Satan, their continued sin, really becomes Satan's tool to use them to attack the church and attack believers and attack the faithful. Hence why we have to keep overcoming. Otherwise we will be given over to a depraved mind. It talks about in Romans 1:18, because they would not acknowledge God, he gave them over to a depraved mind. We're talking here about unbelievers who has heard God's word. Satan's schemes, therefore, are not merely human rebellion. They are way more intelligent than that of a human rebel. And I think this is important that I mention this. Therefore, Satan's plans are not the work of merely worldly people or fleshy, rebellious Christians. That's what he wants you to think. He wants you to think it's just there. And this is what I want to kind of highlight. It says they are spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. You know, Satan was cast out of heaven, but he still roams about the earth to seek who he may devour. He's in the air. He may not be next to Christ in heaven and in that heavenly place, but he's in the heavenlies overall. And this is why we need to take up the full armour of God. We need to have the mind of Christ. We need to walk in the fullness of the Spirit, because when we don't, This is the battle. When we don't walk in the fullness of Christ, people, brothers and sisters, when we don't walk in the fullness of Christ and put on the whole armour, we reduce the enemy to the minions who do his work. Meaning, we reduce the enemy to flesh and blood. We reduce the enemy whose schemes and wiles are way above which a human can comprehend. He will use those people, and he'll be the ones that he sets out and sets forth as minions everywhere. Hendrickson calls them that, minions. I've heard other people calling them that. No, they become his foot soldiers, people who perpetually sin and won't submit to God. But they're not who you're fighting. In other words, we reduce the enemy to flesh and blood, or we reduce the enemy to a person who's doing us wrong or doing the wrong. And listen, I have to be honest, I fell into this trap. Ask yourself how often you argue, or you talk about, or you gossip, or you're bitter, or you have a resentment and all the other things that goes with it, and you never mention the devil once. You've confined the devil and you've reduced them to a person. And when we are not aware of why do we do it? Because we're not aware of who the enemy is. We wrestle and we're not aware who the enemy is. What do? We start to wrestle with flesh and blood. We argue, we resent, we gossip, we blame people. So much Christian talk today is about people, and so little is about the enemy. Satan loves this. Satan loves this. This is part of his game plan, because he can remain anonymous and be cheerleading and directing in the background. Satan loves this because we fight flesh with flesh, and this is his trump card. Is that what happens is that we start to fight flesh with flesh, or soon it becomes flesh fighting flesh when we do not know whom we're truly wrestling with. Matthew 16:21-23, Jesus gives a brilliant example of this. And this is where he confronts Peter. He says, "From that time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day." This is what he started to teach the apostles and the people he was leading. It says, "Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him." I find that astounding. Peter takes Jesus aside and brings correction to him. But began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." Now this is what it says Jesus done. "But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offence to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men.'" And here's the amazing thing here in the context of what I'm saying. Jesus never fought flesh with flesh. He knew it was not God-centred mindfulness that was on Peter's mind, but carnal, selfish pride and ignorance. Peter probably didn't even know fully how he was trying to stop Christ being Christ and trying to stop Christ dying on the cross. But Jesus doesn't say, "Get behind me, Peter." He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Why? Because he was not reducing anything that was trying to stop him to a person. He was refusing to allow that wrestling match to be flesh to flesh, or refusing it to be a person, because he knew they were a prince of darkness over that kind of idea and those mindsets and those beliefs. Hence why we must put on the full armour of God. This armour is not just warfare armour, therefore, but Christ-like minded armour. To not put on the full armour, for me, is to misdiagnose the enemy. Or a better way of putting it, turning the enemy into a person, whom in turn you will no longer fight with armour of God, but you will eventually forget to put on the full armour of God, and you will start to wrestle with them. The Greek word is pale, and wrestle means to endeavour to hold one down, or in more detail, to hold one down by the neck. The devil wants to hold your head down and stand over you in victory. That's his game plan, and that's his way of claiming victory. However, when we forget it's his work, and it's the work of the ruler of darkness, we end up trying to fight people, and we end up trying to wrestle them, and we're wrestling with people, and the enemy in the background is loving it all. We need to know We will not beat the devil playing it his own game, but we also know that God is over all. See you tomorrow, guys.